Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Recently I've been thinking about Arena and the way Arena is structured, where there's like a percentile ranking system and then top 850 or top 50 etc. based on the arena you're running to get your rewards. And I looked at Alliance Quest and Alliance War and I was like, these are fully nominal. There's no percentile in here, and that just seems strange to me and almost unnecessary. But there are pros and cons both ways, and I kind of wanted to evaluate where the percentiles would fall based on the current ranking system, as like where the alliances are as well, in order to get like a proper understanding of the actual like reward structure and how Kabam has micro control, etc. Talk about the pros and cons because it goes both ways. Nominal ranking and percentile ranking both have pros and cons to them. I just personally lean towards percentile. I feel like it's a little more player favored, and here are the arguments I make, but could also be potentially to the detriment of players depending on how Kabam handles it. So that said, first I want to show kind of like why I have these colored indicators where I do. So for 11 to 20 here, this is because this is where you no longer reach tier 5 class catalysts. So below 11 to 20, you don't get a single tier 5 class catalyst crystal. And even the people in 11 to 20 are only getting 2% of a single crystal. Just kind of something to be aware of. And then I have 46 to 90 all the way to 150 marked in orange here, because this is kind of like your harder pushing alliances. These people typically have prestige requirements. They have, are pushing either map 7 and map 6, or at least running map 6 with all modifiers, that kind of a thing. These are people who are, probably pay to play, if not hardcore free to play grinders, or have been around for a long period of time, etc., or very, very intelligent, resource allocation, etc. But yes, again, these are, top players at the end. And then I have in yellow here all the way up to 1200 because I've seen recruitment for this marks in the alliance recruitment. I also know that these are your players who were maybe even pushing map 5. I've seen 1200 from people pushing map 5 with modifiers, and high prestige to boot as well. So you can get here fairly reasonably. And then I have here in red, because this is where, based on my chart here, 100% of players would fall under, assuming all the alliances running Alliance Quest are 30 players each, which is not the case. We know there are many, 10 people alliances and 20 people alliances and all that jazz. So obviously not everybody's going to see the same rewards. Now, the point that I'd like to make is that based on 100,000 people, so this is the column right here, this is just if there were 100,000 people in the game, only 0.6% of the people would be getting tier 5 class catalysts, and only 4.5% of the people would fall in the top 150 alliances, which is a pretty big disparity. And that's for 100,000 people. And honestly, at 100,000 people, I'd say these numbers are relatively reasonable, right? You got to keep in mind that Alliance Quest rank rewards are very well spread out. Most of it comes in the form of glory, right? And at these higher ranks, people are typically using items, right? So they're losing value in their glory because they're technically getting less since it caps off at like 3,400. Additionally, like the scaling up from rank to rank isn't like crazy high. It's not like, oh, you go from 251 to 250 and you're getting 2 more tier 2 alphas. No, you're getting a chunk extra of tier 2 alpha. So it's a pretty reasonable scaling. So I would say at 100,000, this is really reasonable percentile wise. I don't see anything wrong with it. But if I move into like the 250,000, and a notable note here is that Seaton, Man of Legends, has about 250,000 subscribers. So this is a fair baseline, I would say, of a minimum expectation of number of people who are playing the game consistently, right? Like if you play enough to, subscribe to a YouTuber, you probably play enough to be in an alliance. Just kind of like a rough assessment there, or assumption. And in this situation, 0.25% of people are getting a tier 5 class catalyst, and less than 2% are in the top 150 alliances. This is when I start to draw questions. I start to think, at this point, it might be best to shift towards a percentile system, right? Like maybe you can keep the top 100 or so alliances still in a nominal value, and then really, really feel you should stretch the tier 5 class catalysts farther down, because to have only 0.25% of your player base consistently seeing a small micro shift upwards in a rank 3 6-star roster, while the rest, the other 99.75% of the alliances are just left in the dust. it just feels bad. Because that adds up to a point where people are struggling to keep up with prestige because they're just not hitting the same number of rank 3 6 stars. It's an inevitable disparity between, the top end alliances and the lower end alliances that just cannot be bridged, which just is bad for the game. It's bad for the game. I'll be real. And this is the point where I start to think, okay, maybe, spread that wealth between the top 2% or so, and then from 2% onwards, we see the higher end rewards as well, just without the tier 5 class catalyst, shift that down all the way maybe down to 20%, and then start sectioning it maybe every 5% or so, which they've relatively done at this point, every 5 to 10%, give or take, which is really reasonable. And it's really worth to note that if Kabam micro controls these numbers of alliances to match the player base, right, they have full control of these percentages, and they can constantly change or shift them without players having an immediate acknowledgement of it, right? Like if we were in a percentile system, and Kabam was, let's say, saying, oh, 25% of the people have access to tier 5 class catalysts for Alliance Quest on a weekly basis. And then next patch comes out and Kabam says, okay, we shifted it from 0.25%, 0.25%, and we made it 0.15%. The player base would freak, right? But when you say, 20 alliances versus 15, it doesn't feel as bad, right? That shift, that setting method gives them a lot of control without a lot of the transparency or player understanding, because player comprehension of the behind the scenes isn't always matched up with what the developers are doing. And there are pros and cons to that, players don't always know what's best for them, but it's something to be aware, and this is only at 250,000. And even at this point, I think the disparity in the rank rewards, at being at these higher percentages versus being at the lower percentages, it's not too bad, right? Like if we say top 3,500 alliances, give or take, is like the cutoff for where I'd say rewards are reasonable, which personally I think it's more closer to 1,700 or 2,200. This is still like 25% of the player base, and it's really not hard to move up into these higher alliances if you're playing the game consistently and pushing for higher maps, etc. So I'd still say it's pretty reasonable. Even skipping the 500,000 category, it's not until I get to the 1 million category that I am like, this is absolutely unreasonable. Like at this stage, at 1 million, the game absolutely needs to be shifted into a percentile market because it is just ludicrous. That does not mean there are 1 million people actively playing Alliance Quest on a weekly basis with 30-man alliances, because maybe there's less. I don't have those numbers. Kabam does. Maybe they're micro shifting these numbers around in order to match an ideal percentage that they have, etc. I can give them that credit. I'm just pointing it out that I personally think a percentile is better from a intelligent player perspective, as well as transparency of knowledge and information. As a result, we, the player base, would get a kind of perspective of where the game state is, etc. Because at 1 million players, less than 0.1% of the players are seeing tier 5 class catalysts on a basis. That is wild. Absolutely wild. And even worse, less than 0.5% are in the top 150 alliances. And like this is where I would say like alliances who are pushing for higher rewards, that's where you fall in. This is the top 150, maybe in the top 500 for 1.5%. And I just have a tough time believing that like only 1.5% of the game is people pushing for higher rewards. I get the sense it's probably more, and I would like to see that well spread out, because inevitably, like, there's just a disparity, and it only gets worse. And I don't want to see that, because the worse it gets, the worse the state of the game, the worse it is going to be to balance, and it's a juggling puzzle, right? And that's not something I think is ideal. So I think if just in general, Alliance Quest shifted to percentile based, I'd say below the tier 5 class catalyst mark. I would like to see this extended quite a bit, because just based on percentiles, even at like 100,000, 0.6% seems really, really low. I think this could get stretched down to like 2% or so, and then I think the rest of it from there, beyond that nominal whatever happens to be 2%, or maybe it caps off at like 50 alliances or 100 alliances, etc. Make it percentage based from there, and then it'll stay static based on the quantity of people playing the game, and then at least we know where we're at. So those are my thoughts on Alliance Quest. Alliance War is a little similar, but also very different. So an Alliance War, you stop seeing tier 5 class catalysts again at Alliance number 20. See a common theme here. And then Plat ends at 800 and Gold ends at 4,500. Now, I believe personally this is what gives us a relative understanding of the player base, because I feel like most of the alliances really pushing are at least Gold, if not, Plat. There are a good group of people who are pushing silver, who are trying to push into Gold. Yes, that exists. I'm just saying, like, typically speaking, you're Gold or above if you're pushing Alliance War. Like, actually pushing Alliance War with a real roster. Or, sorry, not real roster. I'm not trying to offend, but a developed roster. That's the word I'm looking for. So again, here at the 100,000 mark, these numbers are all the same. 0.6, quarter, 1/8, and 1/16. But if you notice here for Plat, at 100,000 players, it's 24%, and that's super reasonable. If we're only 100,000 players strong pushing Alliance War, rewards are great. Very well balanced, super well structured. If we're 250,000 strong, it's 10% for Plat and above. It's still fairly reasonable, but this is where, again, I start to draw that watermark of like, hey, we're starting to see a pretty big disparity, and by 1 million, only 2.5%, 2.4%, or a quarter, are seeing Plat rewards or above. And again, that just feels really low to me. I think that in a game like Marvel Contest of Champions, which isn't necessarily highly competitively driven, like it is to an extent, but it's not like highly competitive, right? I would like to see these rewards stretched out a bit more. That's all. I don't think that's perfectly unreasonable, but those are my thoughts. And when you see the percentages and you see where they fall in line based on the numbers, I was kind of hoping to see other people's thoughts or hear your pros and cons, maybe anything I missed. Feel free to share. Just, random ramblings. Talk to y'all later. Peace.